All right, I wanted to wrap up the course. Congratulations for surviving these 16 weeks. Polling has gotten some negative publicity. In one respect, I think some people abuse polling, right? And we've done the Twitter polls, right? And I think Twitter polls can be interesting because they are there to sort of engage people, right? But those are not serious polls, right? But because there's these push polls and fake polls and fun polls and whatever, informal polls, um, you can kind of get distracted between serious survey research and then those that are done for other reasons, right? And of course, lots of people have attacked the polls. Donald Trump is famous for attacking the news and polls, right? And so people who don't understand polling, they're like, well, that poll was off. It's like, well, we know statistically speaking, even if you do everything perfect, just by dumb luck, random chance, your poll is going to be off, right? And so depending on sort of your expectations of the poll, right? Some people think that this is some exact science. There's a lot of science behind it, but it's not an exact science because we're trying to understand a true population based on a much smaller sample, right? Which is a very efficient way of knowing something, but it's an imperfect way of knowing something, right? So survey research is not going away. It is ubiquitous with a modern society. It's a form of data collection, and people are always going to be collecting data because they care about making good decisions. And so you have people like, well, you can't trust survey research. Like, I mean, it's like you can't trust doctors. You can't trust, it's like, what, you're not going to ever go to a doctor because doctors, often, you know, they try to diagnose you based on the most likely scenario, right? And they do trial and error. Go, well, it could be this, and then they're wrong. Well, if it wasn't that, then it's this, right? So the medical sciences, right, are far from perfect. But are you going to give up on modern medicine? It'd be ridiculous, right? And so you have the gut reaction of perhaps someone who has less education that are like, yeah, not going to trust doctors, not going to trust the news, not going to trust survey research, right? When medicine is amazing, right, in 2020, uh, and data collection is amazing in 2020, right? And it's so much better now than it was in the past that that attitude is just it's so ignorant, right? And someone in the private sector like Google or AT&T or Coca-Cola or whatever, they just don't care that the 2016 polling was off. They just don't care, right? They're going to collect survey data. They're going to collect data in lots of different manners, right? Because they care about making good decisions, right? They're not in this weird debate about fake polls, right? They're hiring people that know what they're doing to collect information about consumer preferences, right? And we're always going to be measuring voter sentiment, even though I would argue measuring voter behavior is harder than most any other measurements. We're still going to keep doing it, right? Regardless of the criticism, right? And the criticisms can make us do better research, right? So we can't shy away from the criticism. I think it really matters who's criticizing, right? Donald Trump knows nothing about survey research, so when Donald Trump says something about surveys, it's literally meaningless, right? But if someone who has a PhD in research methodology or what have you says, look, this is a real problem, well, we need to take those criticisms, to heart. And again, the survey research has changed dramatically, and people criticized the idea. I mean, first, when we used to do face-to-face only, the advent of telephone surveys were made fun of. And then when telephone surveys were the best method, people made fun of the idea of online or email surveys. And those are very, very common now, right? And so the survey industry needs to be open to new ideas and criticisms. But, right, the criticism that we're getting from pundits, right, tend to be very inaccurate, right? Even very careful attempts to measure the true population, right, often fall short. And in fact, I think we're probably going to see some severe limitations on measures on demographics here in the United States because of the COVID and switching to sort of an online data collection method, which is sort of new to people. Right? I don't know if you received it, but you probably should have received a postcard with an information that you would log on and you would enter that information, which requires some extra steps for some people, especially older people, right? And then we cut the U.S. Census data collection a little short this year. So our attempt to try to count the entire population as directed by the U.S. Census, right, and directed by the Constitution, is going to fall short, right? And in fact, many experts believe that just a very, very careful random sample, right, might actually be much cheaper and in the end maybe more accurate than an attempted full count, right? And in fact, that has been proposed but rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution as the census is a true count of the true population. And so we go out and we try to count every single person out there. And we fall short, right? So a survey is imperfect, but a census is going to be imperfect, right? We're never going to stop doing the census, right? And in fact, businesses would cry foul if we tried to stop the census, because businesses and economists and financial experts, they rely on this demographic information, even though we know it's imperfect, right? Imperfect data is better than no data, right? And so you're going to have lots of different organizations continually asking you questions, right? Whether it's CSN asking you questions about teachers and your evaluations of them, or whether it's a department store asking you about your preferences or what prices you're willing to pay, right? You're always going to be asked questions. In fact, perhaps we're asked too many questions, because survey research has gotten a little bit cheaper through some mechanisms, that everyone's doing it because they want that data. The problem is, if everyone's doing it, you and I get inundated and we might start to say no to some of these surveys, right? And that's a problem that survey researchers have to figure out, right? So really, we want to get a good sample, right? So that we can extrapolate to a larger population. But that sample has to be collected in an effective and efficient manner. We can't spend billions of dollars on that, right? We need good data, but in a reasonable amount of time and a reasonable amount of money, right? And we're going to be aware that there's going to be lots of sources of error. We call this total survey error, right? And so total survey error incorporates sampling error, which is just dumb luck, right? Is you do everything perfect, but you just happen to get too few educated people or too few less educated people, right? And so you can't get rid of sampling error. You can lower sampling error by increasing your sample size, but we've seen in this class that you really have to increase your sample size a lot more to just even reduce sampling error just a little bit. So really, anything over 1,000 doesn't get you a lot of reduction in sampling error, right? Then we have non-sampling error, which is based on measurement error, which could be a product of bad questions, right? Coverage error. We just not getting people that don't have access to the internet or don't have a phone or what have you. And so your sample frame, your list of people, isn't inclusive to everyone, right? And then non-response error. People just say no to your survey. You have them in the list. You have homeless people. You have rich people. You got poor people. They're just saying no, right? That's non-response error, right? And they can say no to the entire survey, or they could say no to a particular question. And then there's post-survey error, and some of you guys have experienced this, that you have a data set even if that data set's perfect, you did something wrong in SPSS, right? Or you analyzed something incorrectly. Lots of things can go wrong, which is why you need trained people that know what they're doing to conduct survey research and to analyze survey research, because there are potential error, right? I mean, you look into any field, there's potential error, right? The medical field, there's lots of error, right? Whether it's surgical error or diagnosis error, right? You know, what have you. Or what was it when we landed a rover on Mars? Something went wrong. Someone forgot to convert from the American measurement system to the metric system, right? Luckily, I think it survived, but there were some problems, right? Whatever field you're talking about, right? There's going to be error that's going to happen, right? The more we know about that error and understand about it, we're able to reduce that error, right? So sampling error, as we talked about, is just luck of the draw, right? We can measure that through the margin of error, right? And we know that larger samples can reduce that sampling error, but only marginally, and it gets more and more expensive. Now, with modern technology, raising your sample size is cheaper now than ever before, right? Then we have non-sampling error, right? Measurement error, coverage error, non-response error, right? We can control some of this by being careful when we're designing survey samples, right, and questionnaires, right? This is harder to reduce, right, than sampling error, because sampling error, we can increase our sample size. Here, we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful in trying to cover as much of the population as possible and making it more likely that people are going to respond to our surveys and all of our questions, right? And so, as I mentioned before, surveys have gotten a lot of criticism, and perhaps rightly so, because there have been some important events that they've gotten it wrong a bit. 2016. Now, the 2016 polling actually did pretty good in predicting the national vote and what percentage Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump would get. That was within the margin of error. But when it came down to particular states and predicting the Electoral College, which is harder, it went badly wrong, right? And one thing is, what we found is that different organizations are surveying different states. And what we think went wrong, one theory, is that the surveys didn't weight on education, because lower educated white men were much more likely to vote for Trump than any other demographic group, right? And what we find is less educated people of all walks of life are less likely to answer surveys, right? And so you need to make sure that you weight your data to account for that, right? That was one theory. The problem is that a lot of organizations started to do that in 2020, and it may have helped a little bit, but we were still off, right? But another event in 2016, a very big event, was the Brexit vote, right, in England, to decide whether they're going to leave the European Union or not. And most of the organizations that surveyed predicted that most people would say, voted to stay in the European Union and not to leave or exit the European Union. And they were wrong. Turnout was much higher than expected. Usually in a referendum vote, which was sort of like non-binding, but the prime minister had promised to pursue it. In a non-binding referendum vote, turnout tends to be quite low. It was much higher than expected. You also had a lot of don't knows, and it was predicted that if you said you weren't sure about the issue, you would probably vote to stay because that's the status quo. That didn't happen. A lot of the don't knows at the last minute voted to leave, right? And then you even had some anecdotal evidence that people who voted to leave didn't actually think that that would actually happen, right? And you had a little bit of buyer's remorse and say, can we have this election again? I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, but that was one explanation, right? 2020 actually ended up being actually a little bit worse than 2016, even though um, uh, the polling predicted that Biden was going to win, and Biden did win. When it came to the national vote, it actually was worse than the 2016 predictions, right? And there's different theories about this. One theory is the shy Trump voter. Trump is pretty controversial in the things that he says, right? And so there are some people in a certain group of people that if they admitted that they liked Trump, like in my group, right? My little circle of colleagues and friends and family, if you admitted that you liked Trump or voted for Trump, you would get a lot of crap, excuse my language, right? And so, in some areas, saying that you're a Trump supporter, what was problematic, right? And so you had people that were not going to share their preferences, and the argument is that the average Trump voter doesn't trust polls. Not surprising, given Trump says so many negative things about polls, and they're less likely to answer a survey, right? Now, a lot of these are just sort of like, you know, trying to get out of the fact that they got it wrong, right? Now, again, they weren't that off, right? I mean, if you look at the 50 states, right, like, all right, they got a lot of them correct in how they would go, right? And people do change their minds. They change their mind on voting. They're like, yeah, I'm not going to vote. And then at the last minute, I think I'm going to fill out this mail ballot and vote, right? People actually change their mind all the time. And so measuring voting behavior is very hard. I don't think these people actually need to explain why they got it wrong or justify survey research, but we want to know what happened so we can improve our ability to collect data in an efficient, effective manner. But we know we're never going to be spot on. But clearly, if you're running for office, this polling data in 2016 or 2020 often was fairly accurate when it came to predicting who might win a congressional race, who might win a Senate seat, who might win the presidency, how strong support was in California versus Michigan or Nevada. This information was valuable. Was it perfect in predicting every state or every race? Absolutely not. But it's no big surprise, looking at demographics, looking at survey research, right, that Trump won some battleground states in 2016, and Biden won some battleground states in 16, or even just identifying battleground states. How do we do it? We do it with voting behavior, demographics, and survey research, right? And so we know what we know because of survey research. But even with that knowledge, it's a moving target, and we can make predictions that are inaccurate, right? A measurement error, right, which is another form of the total survey error, right, is when you get a person in your random sample, and they're representative of the true population, and they're willing to answer all your questions, but your question wording sucks, right? And it's hard to know what is the best wording, right? Also, you might have great wording, but the format of your question is unprofessional looking, or the response options are inaccurate. I forgot to add a picture, but there was a survey sent to me by a company that I love, Stata. They create a really good statistical software, sort of like SPSS, but a little bit harder to use, but a little bit more powerful. I still love SPSS. And I saw right in the survey there they had a mistake, and I was like, in their response options, I was like, here is this well-known statistical software company, and they're sending out a survey, and there's an easily identified flaw that is going to affect the results of their analysis. I could just tell right there. It's like, their numbers, their statistical analysis is going to be off because of that one mistake, right? So survey research has to be done carefully, right? And there's ways to avoid measurement error that we've talked about in this class. Pre-test your questions, right? Um, Ask for information on a particular topic that you're interested in more than one question. So if there's a minor flaw in that one question, you're going to back up that data or capture that feeling or belief with another question, right? Because we know that there's no perfect question out there. And then, of course, you can actually run statistics to see if there's any flaws in questions or which question might be capturing something slightly different. And lots of literature out there that talks about test, retest design, structural equation modeling, lots of different factor analysis, lots of different ways to sort of try to understand when you ask a certain type of question, what is it capturing? How is it being interpreted, right? And we talked about this with some of the research that I've done with some colleagues regarding measuring how do you ask if you're happy, how do you ask if you support gay marriage or same-sex marriage, right? There's no perfect response, but to understand how different question wording gets different responses is important, right? And of course, I think what's really going to be a big challenge and what went wrong in 2016 and 2020 is the non-response and coverage error, right? We're just not getting people. They're not answering surveys because either they're inundated with surveys or they don't trust surveys, right? Or they're just busy, right? They're just busy, right? Clearly, it costs money to do multiple attempts, but Pew Research had done an interesting study that at a certain point, you're just not going to get a hold of a person, right? And they kind of found a sweet spot around 5 attempts, 6 attempts. But if you move it to 20 attempts, that person's not going to answer, right? Typically. So again, even if you have $1 billion to spend on a survey, you're not going to have perfect coverage or perfect response, right? And some questions are not going to be answered. There's some people who just feel uncomfortable. Doesn't mean you can't answer those questions, but you can maybe, right, ask them in a certain way that gets them. It says, you could even say, some people don't feel comfortable answering this question, but we can promise that this is anonymous and is used only for statistical purposes, and we'd appreciate response on income or race or sexual activity or drug use or what have you, right? So there's ways to increase sample responses to certain questions that people are sensitive to, right? And we've learned this through experience because we've been collecting survey data for so long now that we kind of know what works, right? Now, things change, right? Early voting is expanding. I've found that once someone has already voted, they're less likely to talk about how they voted because it's sort of considered a secret ballot, right? And so you have to be careful about asking, if you've already voted. And so creating hypotheticals like, well, if the election was held today, who would you vote for? And then asking later, the early voting is going on. Have you already voted, right? Once you ask them, oh, have you already voted? They're now a little bit say, yeah, I voted. And then when you ask their preference, they put 2 and 2 together. They now realize they're telling the person who they voted for. And all of a sudden, now it's a little bit different dynamic. You have to be careful. You have to respect people's privacy. You have to be careful about question wording and question ordering. And I think also having a professional look and having a professional organization where they can look and inspect the organization, right? So here's an organization does that survey and they say, here's our website, here's information about the project, right? You can build confidence, right, when you're asking. I get a lot of calls and I will usually answer any survey that someone calls me because I feel obligated. But when you ask them, right, about the organization, it's usually a middleman. It's just a survey organization that doesn't create any surveys. It's just a call center. And they're contracted out by another organization. So whenever I ask, like, oh, what organization are you working for? It's like, actually, I don't, the caller will say, I don't know. I'm paid to make phone calls, and we do lots of different surveys. Some of them are political, some of them are, Coca-Cola or what have you. So that person can't even answer the question, what organization is doing that? And that doesn't convey a lot of trust, right? I like this survey that was sent to me by the Election Integrity Project, because they even asked, would you like us to send the final results to you? And they eventually sent me an email with the final report. So again, that builds trust, right? So there's ways that we can kind of say, hey, we care about your opinion. We're a legitimate organization. We care that you might get something out of it. We'll send you the final results, right? And so there's ways to build that trust that may be more important today than ever before. And then, of course, analyzing the data. Even if you have perfect data, which never happens, you can make mistakes. Cleaning, recoding the data, right? Choosing the wrong statistical tool that really isn't going to analyze the data that you think is going to, right? Interpreting the statistical results correctly. In this class, some of you, were very good at this, but it's one of the things that I've found throughout my career. Asking a student, all right, is this result statistically significant or not? Even if you did everything correctly and the numbers are correct, your interpretation of those results end up being wrong. And that's probably, I think, one of the biggest things that many students have struggled when I've taught this class before. In this class and in prior semesters, is that there's so many numbers to look at, you look at the wrong number and say, aha, that is statistically significant, when it wasn't, right? And of course, we can control this error by being more careful and learning more about statistical analysis and data analysis, right? And again, as we get better with our skills, we're less likely to make those mistakes. Survey research often talks about 4 types of validity issues. One's a construct validity problem, which refers to the measures that we use, right? Are we truly measuring what we think we're measuring? So measuring COVID, right? When we're trying to measure the scope of the problem, the number of cases is only one type of measure, right? We might want to know the infection rate, right? Because not everyone's going to get tested who's sick. And some people who might be a little bit more of a hypochondriac will go get tested even though they have no reason to get tested. And so when we're measuring the problem of COVID, right, which is not even a survey question, right, we're not exactly sure what measures are best. And we might need multiple measures, right? We need number of infections. We need the infection rate, right? We might need hospitalization rates, right? Because one measure might not actually be measuring what we think it is, right? And relying on just one measure can be problematic if we want valid analysis. Then there's internal validity, the strength of the causal linkages between particular measures, right? So when we are trying to understand why someone voted for Joe Biden, right, we have to make sure that we're collecting information from the most important, right, variables out there, right? If we're not asking important questions, right, that are relevant to voter behavior, then our statistical model is going to be very weak. If we don't ask about attitudes about COVID, attitudes about immigration, attitudes about terrorism, attitudes about crime, attitudes about what have you, then you're not going to be able to truly understand, right, why someone voted for Trump or voted for Biden. And so to understand those causal connections, we have to make sure that we are knowledgeable and we are able to use a theory to be able to say, all right, these are the most important independent and dependent variables that we need for a statistical model. Or if we want to understand the economy and whether the economy is growing, right? What variables are we going to include in that? Are we including wages? Are we including price of natural resources? Are we including the price of oil? Are we including demographic changes? Are we including the birth rate? What are the variables that are most important in analyzing economic growth? And so our data analysis requires collection and access to the most important measures out there, right? Then there's external validity, which refers to the generalizability of our study. So if you interview one person, one police officer, that is not very generalizable to the larger police force, right, within that department or, of course, within the general population of the police, right? But an in-depth interview with a police officer or several police officers can still get some valuable information. It just doesn't have very high external validity, right? I think in-depth interviews are very fruitful and can also generate great ideas to ask in a larger survey study, right? But in-depth interviews typically are not generalizable, right? And then, of course, we want statistical conclusion validity, the degree to which a conclusion about a relationship among the variables that we have access to is correct, right, or reasonable. And this involves ensuring the use of adequate sampling procedures, appropriate statistical tests, and reliable measures, so that when you conduct your statistical analysis, you have some valid results because you're using the appropriate statistical test. The data that you're using, right, has been adequately collected in a careful manner, and it's representative of the true population. And all of this is a balancing act, right? We're never going to have a study that is going to have perfect validity on all of these dimensions, right? We want to achieve research objectives by providing accurate estimates, right? But it must be feasible. It can't. If we're trying to predict an election, then that means that we have to collect this data in a fairly quick time because the election is approaching, right? So it must be maximizing economy, meaning maximizing time and financial costs, right? Because we also would like to do multiple surveys. We don't want to just spend time on one survey. We want, if we're interested in the economy, if we're interested in the presidential election, whatever, or we're interested in consumer preferences, all those things change over time. So we want to be able to take multiple snapshots, maybe once a month. And that means we have to have a large budget. That means that each survey can't be perfect. We can't afford to have a perfect survey. We need a survey that is feasible but achieves our objectives. And our objectives are never going to be, it has to be perfect, right? That's impossible, right? Even with like the COVID vaccine, you're never going to have a perfect vaccine that has 100% effectiveness. If you're going to wait for that, you're going to be waiting too long, right? And so when it comes to research, we know it's never going to be perfect, right? But it needs to be good enough to achieve our objectives, but it needs to be feasible. And all these criticisms of survey research, right? It's just not going to, survey research is not going to go away. It's just not, right? Google and Coca-Cola and IBM and CSN and whatever, they're going to keep collecting surveys. And I don't know about you, but I get text message surveys, I get phone call surveys, I get email surveys, I get bombarded, right? That's not going to change, even though some people are like, well, I just don't know if survey research is very good. Yeah, great. You don't have to enter that field, right? But all these other companies and organizations, they will continue to do survey research because they understand that even imperfect data is better than no data at all, right? And again, we can make surveys better, right? We can reduce non-sampling error, right? We can make surveys shorter, right? So that people are more likely to respond to the survey and answer all the questions, right? We have to realize that community feedback and survey responses is a precious resource that we can't overuse. And it was great when I was at Elon University, the people who had access to all the student emails, they would basically say no to everyone who said, "Oh, I'd like to do a survey of students," and they're like, "No, no, no, no," because they get from every professor, from every department, from every they all say, "I want to do a survey on why students are not majoring in political science," right? And the people that were in control of institutional research would say, "No, we survey the students this many times a year, right? And that's it. If you have an important question, send it to us. We might include it because the problem is our students get way too many surveys requests from different organizations. So we do not give anyone this email list. Nobody. We control that because we don't consider student feedback a precious resource. We just say, hey, just survey students. But everyone's doing it, right? Elon realized fewer surveys to students is better because you're not going to annoy them and they're more likely to answer those surveys that you do, right? And again, you have to stress where this organization, where the survey is coming from, why you need the data, that you really, really appreciate them completing the survey. And if they want to ask any questions about the survey, here's the contact information. And if you want access to the final results, here's where you can find it, or we'll send you an email, right? And so you can build that trust. I think we often default to the agree-disagree grids. I like these. These are useful. Respondents know how to use them, and so these are never going to go away. But I think in some cases, overuse of these is problematic because you will get people just clicking down the middle. And of course, if you're smart, you have that one question that says, this is a test question. Please select agree for this response. They tell you which one to answer just to see if you're paying attention or you're actually reading the questions, right? And of course, we already talked about double barreling questions. It's very common, easy to do. Even professionals do it, right? How happy are you with your phone company's rates and customer service? Those are two separate subjects. You might think their customer service are great, but their rates are way too high, or vice versa. Yeah, great rates, but man, when I have a question about my bill, I have to be on hold for an hour, right? You need two separate questions to answer that. We already talked about this, right? Asking respondents things that they don't know. Oh, very tempting, right? We want to ask hypothetical questions. We want to ask questions about the future. Hey, what are you going to do next year? We ask abstract questions, right? We use wording or business concepts or scientific concepts that people don't understand. Oh, do you support partial birth abortion? It's like they don't know what that is. All right, and so you have to understand the limitations of a survey question and the limitations of a respondent, right? And so your questions have to be specific and concrete. They really have to ask about the present or very recent past. They have to be dealing with the real experience. They have to ask about what they think, what they believe, how they feel. People can answer that, right? But they have a hard time explaining their own behavior, right? And so here's an example. It's kind of a funny example. If we were to introduce a new feature, a free kitten for signing up as an Airbnb host, how likely would you be to continue hosting with us, right? It's just one, it's a long question, and it's like you're asking like, how likely would you continue, with this company, right? I don't know. I guess, is it a 50% chance that I'm very likely, I'm somewhat likely, right? It's an abstract question asking about a hypothetical future. But this question gets at the heart of it. How excited are you by the idea of receiving a free kitten for signing up as an Airbnb host, right? If you're allergic to cats, you'd be like, I'm not very excited about this offer, right? But if you love cats, right, and you're like, oh, I'm very excited about this offer, right? And again, you could fill this in without, free kitten. It could be free TV or, free trip to Jamaica, right? And so you have to think about the questions very carefully, right? And you're going to get better data that way, right? I'm going to end with the notion of big data. It's something that's not my field, and it's not really a term that my generation uses, but it's thrown out all the time. And survey research is part of this, right? I see this everywhere now. Big data, right? And I've done research on it, and there's no concrete definition about this, right? Historically, we've probably been a big data society for decades, right? We just didn't use that term. We've been collecting large amounts of data through various mechanisms just for decades now, decades and decades, right? So big data really is just sort of addressing the volume of data that we have access to if we're willing to do a deep dive, right? And so, one academic article talked about really big data is really concerned about volume, right? So Google, when it does surveys, isn't doing a random sample of 1,000 people. It's collecting. It has access to millions and billions of people, right? So does Facebook, right? So we're moving beyond just the traditional telephone survey where you collect 1,000 people, or even just an online survey where you collect 5,000 people. Really, we have information on millions of people. And the data can be collected very quickly because everyone's connected to the internet. And so you slip in a quick question in a Google search or what have you, because everyone's Googling things all the time. I might Google things 12 times a day, right, or more, right? And we have a variety, right, of access, not just on attitudes, but what you click on, right? Loyalty cards when you shop at Smith's or Albertsons or what have you. We have shopping data, purchasing data. I'm amazed at when I click on something. My wife is very passionate about cryptocurrency, and so I let her deal with that. But I'll do a little bit of research on when she says something, and I'll look it up. And then in Facebook, immediately that day, I'll get advertisements for some type of crypto something, right? And so it's amazing, so everything's sort of connected. What I search on Google, what I search on Facebook, what I search on whatever, all this is getting collected, and we can analyze this data in a very sort of specific manner, and we have access people what they're clicking on. We might have access to demographics. We might have access on you name it, right? And so we don't just say, oh, well, this person voted for Biden and they're African American and they are concerned about immigration. We have a lot more information, high resolution information about individuals, right? And we can connect different data sets with other sources of information. So if we're interested in health, right, or behavior, shopping behavior, we might be able to connect that information eventually. Some of this information is private because of HIPAA and certain federal laws, but some of the stuff is already being integrated, right? Because this data is being collected when you go to the doctor, when you answer a survey, when you swipe your loyalty cards at Smith's, when you click on something on Google, right? And we can connect this information so that we have a much more holistic picture of an individual respondent. And big data tends to be flexible so that you can add new variables and easily expand the scope of your study or the size of your data set. So the problem that I ran into when I was director of the Elon poll doing telephone surveys or even internet surveys was you would keep it to a relatively short length, which is always good advice. So you had to select certain variables and leave out some variables. And then you launch your survey and you start calling people or you launch it out through the internet. And then you realize, oh, I really wish I could have asked that one question that I forgot to ask. Or something happened, a hurricane happened or something, and you want to ask about global warming or something like that. much harder to do in these single studies that I was used to doing a internet survey or telephone survey. With big data, you just say, all right, let's because you're constantly collecting data, you just add another question to that, or you go and look for that information. Oh, hey, let's see how close people are to the coast regarding attitudes to global warming. And one study found that even if Republicans tend to be less concerned about global warming, or feel that it's really something that is sort of naturally occurring and is not being exacerbated by human behavior, driving cars, what have you. We find that Republicans are less concerned about global warming. Not the case when you're a Republican that lives by the coast. When you're a Republican that lives by the coast, you're kind of much more aware of climate change, and you're more concerned about climate change, right? So we can have locational data. And again, I've studied and published lots of research showing that we are a product of our environment, our physical environment, right? Not just our social environment. And so we can add these characteristics in big data. And so survey research is part of big data, right? Because they want to incorporate attitudinal information, but it's connecting it with shopping behavior and locational data, right? So big data is really just linking lots and lots of data sets together so that we can do more complicated analysis, right? And that's the hot term today, right? Not something that I learned about as an undergraduate, even a graduate student, and really wasn't even talking about this issue among colleagues when I was director of the Elon Poll. But the last 5 years, I cannot go anywhere without seeing this term, big data, and I love it. I love it because it does really open up this notion of survey research, demographics, and sort of technology being able to reach out to lots and lots of nooks and crannies of society, right? It's something that really I couldn't have imagined doing when I was first learning about statistics and survey research, right? And really, this big data is important because it really offers new opportunities to understand human behavior and society, right? And really, industries are really, really interested in this because, right, we want to be able to make profits, right? So the retail industry, they are interested in transaction history. How many transactions are people doing? Their browser history, their credit history, right? Social media consumption and discussions, right? And so people are actually scouring social media to see what people are talking about, and we can do that. Computers can go and say, what's trending on social media, right? What's being said about Coca-Cola? What's being said about the Super Bowl? What's being said about the NFL? What's being said about higher education, right? That's being voluntarily said out there, right? So the retail industry is really interested in collecting all this data about your transaction, what you're searching on the internet, all these different things. The medical industry is really interested in big data, right? Patient data, doctor data, hospital data, consumer behavior, social media, all this information to find out what are people doing, what kind of risky behavior are they engaged in? Are they getting annual physicals? What are they asking their doctors? What are doctors prescribing? What's the length of a typical appointment with the doctor? I mean, all the medical industry is just obsessed with collecting data to make it a more efficient system, right? Transportation. Oh, I mean, I don't know about you, but even in the age of COVID, traffic is still amazingly problematic. Just imagine if we lived in Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco. And so really, consumer behavior, people that ride mass transit, rider behavior and preferences, the types of cars that we're purchasing, carpooling, asset management, road infrastructure, road use, toll bridges, toll roads, traffic management, route planning, really incorporating survey data, observation of behaviors, GPS information, right? Big data is incorporating all of this information. And as your book notes, right, those researchers who wrote our textbook, they often did research in transportation. And I've done surveys because I actually, before COVID, frequently took the bus because I'm a little bit of a liberal concerned about global warming. And I just, would say, hey, I'm going to take the bus so I can, try to save the environment. I would often get surveys asking me about, what I thought, where am I going, how do I use the bus, what would make it more user friendly, what have you. And so really, you name an industry, they're concerned about survey research. They're concerned about changing demographics, right? A growing Latino population, an aging population, right? And they're interested in linking all this information with other types of data set. That's big data, right? Survey research is not going away because big data is not going away. And survey research is an important part of big data, but only, I would say, a small part of big data. So is demographic data, so is data analysis and um, observable behavior data. And this creates new careers, right? Data collection, data cleaning, data analysis, right? Data visualization. I mean, you name it, right? And again, you don't have to be a computer scientist to be part of this. There are people who study psychology to understand, well, how do you get someone to answer a particular question and what's the best way to ask that question? Psychologists are interested in that, right? There are, of course, people interested in computers. You have mathematicians, statisticians. You have people in business, right? So if we're going to understand business with big data, you need to know someone who understands business. They don't have to have a PhD in statistics, but you need to have someone working in this field that understands business concepts, right? So all these different fields, right, are going to be related to data collection, and you're going to see sort of more and more of these types of skills being required in more and more fields, right? And of course, this one class is really just a scratch of the surface to see if you're interested in this. And I think that um, uh, really, even if you're not going to go into the field of survey research, if you're a professor or an administrator at Clark County School District or CSN or UNLV, those organizations are constantly doing surveys, right? So you need to have some knowledge of surveys and data collection so that if you are an administrator and someone says, let's do a survey, you kind of know a little bit what's going to be necessary in doing this, rather than like, okay, piece of cake, let me whip something up in 5 minutes and we'll send it out. That would be a waste of time, right? And then you're asking students or professors to answer the survey that is a bad survey because you didn't realize the complexity of it, right? So whether you're a nurse, whether you're in law enforcement, whether you're in business finance, right, you are going to come across surveys, survey data, or it might fall in your lap, says, you know what, our department needs to conduct a survey, right? Whether you're a journalist, you need to understand survey and big data. And so hopefully this class has given you a nice foundation. But again, you might want further training. And CSN offers lots of classes that I think are related to this course. Our Department of Social Sciences offers principles in statistics, right? The Psych and Social Department have a cross-listed course, Introduction to Statistical Methods. You have Stat 152. You have computer classes, because often we're using computers to analyze the survey data and statistics, right? IS 101, that I think it's a useful class. It's really Microsoft Office. You learn Microsoft Word, you learn Microsoft Excel, you learn PowerPoint, maybe Microsoft Access, which are all related to database, spreadsheets, data, and presentation of that data. So I actually think IS 101 is a pretty good class. And then if you love that class, you can move on to Introduction to Programming. Not necessary, but if you love computers, and then you could even move on to Computer Information Technology 180, which is database concepts in SQL. Again, you may have already fulfilled your political science degree and you don't have any space for these types of courses, which is perfectly fine. But again, I think if you can fit in your schedule some course that's related to computers or statistics that can build on this class, I think that just reinforces some of those principles. And I think these are just valuable skills that are not going to go away. It doesn't mean that if you take 2 classes, you're going to be expert in statistics, but you'll have a foundation that you are skeptical of the data, but you're also skeptical of people who are like, oh, this is just garbage, right? You can't trust polls, you can't trust the news, right? And so that healthy skepticism allows you to understand the true nature and value of statistics and survey research and demographics, rather than being either someone who's a zealot who's like, oh, I love this so much and it can never be wrong, or someone who says, yeah, I'm never going to go to a doctor, I'm never going to get a vaccine, and I'm never going to do a poll, right? We don't want to be either one of those zealots, right? We want to be someone that has a healthy skepticism, but also a healthy understanding of how valuable these tools can be. All right. Well, that was a little bit of a long, boring, concluding lecture, but it's the last time you have to hear the sound of my voice. Again, if you have any ever questions or concerns about the course, or in the future you have any interest or want to hit me up about something that's going on in modern survey research, feel free to reach out. I hope you found the course useful, and see you around.